The morning Mary Kendrick rode into Sallow Creek, Texas. The dust on the main street swirled up around her horse's hooves like the town itself was trying to warn her away, and every woman she passed leaned toward the nearest ear and whispered the same three words: "Stay away from graves." She had heard those words twice before she even dismounted, once from the widow who ran the dry goods store, a round-faced woman named Hattie Bloom, who pressed a sack of flour into Mary's hands before she had asked for anything, and once from the postmaster's wife, who hung out of her second-floor window to deliver the warning as though it were urgent news that could not wait. By the time Mary tied her bay mare to the post in front of the Sallow Creek Hotel, she felt she had received a full accounting of a man she had never met, and none of it matched what the advertisement in the San Antonio Herald had said. The advertisement had been modest, which was part of what drew her to it. Most of the ranchers advertising for capable hands described acreage and cattle counts with the breathless enthusiasm of men trying to sell something. The Graves advertisement simply said, "Foreman position, Red Bluff Ranch, Sallow Creek County, Texas. Knowledge of cattle, horses, and accounting required. Room and board provided. Inquire Aaron Graves, 1882." She had inquired by letter, received a letter back that was brief and professional, and accepted the position because she needed the work, and she was not the kind of woman who let idle gossip make decisions for her. She was 26 years old, and she had managed her father's ranch outside of Abilene for 4 years before a flash flood took the house, the barn, and her father in the same black week. She had sold off the remaining cattle to cover debts, packed everything she owned into 2 saddlebags and a trunk, and set out to find something worth putting her hands to again. She was not fragile. She was not looking for anyone to rescue her. She had simply answered an advertisement. What she had not anticipated was that the entire town of Sallow Creek would greet her as though she were walking into a burning building. Hattie Bloom, who seemed to have appointed herself the guardian of Mary's well-being before they had properly introduced themselves, followed her into the hotel lobby and stood at the front desk while Mary signed the register. "You the one that answered Graves's advertisement?" Hattie asked, even though it was plainly obvious she already knew the answer. "I am," Mary said. "And you know the position?" "Foreman, yes, ma'am." Hattie folded her hands. "Foreman, not cook, not housekeeper." "Foreman," Mary repeated, meeting the older woman's eyes with the kind of calm that she had learned was more effective than defensiveness. "I ran my father's operation in Abilene for 4 years. I have handled drives, payroll, and contract negotiations. Mr. Graves's letter indicated he reviewed my qualifications and found them satisfactory." Hattie studied her for a long moment, and there was something in her expression that was not unkind. It was worried. "It's not your qualifications I'm concerned about, sweetheart. Aaron Graves is a fine rancher. Good land, good cattle, pays fair. It's just that he's a man who got burned, and burned men run cold, and cold men can be harder to work for than mean ones." Mary picked up her room key. "I appreciate the warning, Mrs. Bloom. I genuinely do. But I've worked for difficult men before, and I have never let a man's temperament stand between me and honest work." She meant every word of it. She just had no idea, standing there in that dim hotel lobby with the dust still on her coat and the summer heat pressing through every gap in the building, that Aaron Graves would turn out to be nothing like a difficult man. He would turn out to be something far more complicated than that. She rode out to Red Bluff Ranch the next morning at first light, because she had always believed in being early, and she had always believed in making a first impression that could not be misread. The land outside of Sallow Creek opened up as she rode west, the scrub brush giving way to longer grass, and eventually to the rolling country that explained why anyone would ranch here. Red Bluff itself was a long sandstone ridge that caught the early sun and glowed a deep amber, and the ranch sat at its base with the settled, permanent look of a place that had been built by someone who intended to stay. The main house was not large by the standards of some of the spreads she had seen, but it was well-built, good timber, solid porch, windows that were actually square. The outbuildings were in good repair. The fencing she could see ran straight and tight. The cattle she spotted on the near pasture were healthy and well-fed. All of it told her something about the man who ran it before she ever laid eyes on him. Aaron Graves came out of the barn when he heard her horse, and for a moment he just stood there with his hat pushed back and a rope coiled over his shoulder, and looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read. He was a tall man, lean in the way that men who work outdoors tend to be lean, with dark hair going silver at the temples and sun-dark skin, and a face that was perhaps 40 years old or thereabouts, a face that had once been easy and had since become careful. He was not unkind-looking. He was not cold-looking. He was the look of a man who had decided something and was living with the decision. "Miss Kendrick," he said. It was not a question, but it had a slight lift to it that made it feel like he was giving her room to confirm or deny. "Mr. Graves," she said, and swung down from the saddle with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. She held out her hand. He looked at it for half a second before he shook it, a firm handshake, working man's grip, no condescension in it. She noted that. "You rode out early," he said. "I prefer to start as I mean to go on," she said. "Is that a problem?" The corners of his mouth moved just barely. "No, come in and we'll talk through what the position actually looks like." She followed him into the barn, which smelled of hay and horses and iron, and everything that she had been missing since Abilene, and she felt something in her chest loosen slightly, the way a fist loosens when the crisis has passed. She had not known she was still holding onto that fist until just then. He pulled out a rough wooden stool and nodded to the one opposite, and she sat down and they talked business for the better part of 2 hours. He was direct. He asked good questions. He did not talk down to her, and he did not look at her the way some men looked at a woman in a working capacity, that look that was equal parts surprise and reluctant respect. He just looked at her as though she were a person who had come to discuss a job, which was exactly what she was. By the time he had walked her through the herd numbers, the seasonal schedule, the 2 hands who were permanent on the payroll, a young man named Clem Dyer who was 19 and eager, and an older man named Dutch Hooper who was 45 and reliable, and the accounts that needed proper management, she was certain she could do the work, and she told him so without making it sound like a boast. "I'll need to review the ledgers before I can give you an accurate picture of where the accounts stand," she said. "From what you've described, it sounds like the spring records have some gaps." "They do," he said, without apology but also without defensiveness. "I have not been the most organized in that regard." "That's what you hired me for," she said. Something shifted in his expression at that, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were told about me. In town." It was not a question either, and she could see that he was used to that, used to being talked about, used to people arriving with preformed notions. "I was told you were done with women," she said, because she saw no point in dancing around it. "Which I took to mean of a personal nature, and which is entirely your business and has no bearing on mine." He looked at her steadily, and she saw something pass through his eyes, something old and not quite healed over, but also something that was not hostile. "It's accurate," he said, "in that personal regard." "Then we understand each other," she said. "I'm not here for anything other than the work." He nodded. "Good," he said, and there was a note in that word that she would not have been able to name precisely, but that she thought sounded less like relief and more like a man lowering a wall just a fraction, just enough to let some air in. She moved into the small foreman's cabin that sat 40 yards behind the main house that same afternoon. It was a single room with a good iron stove, a window that faced east so the morning light came straight in, and a porch just wide enough for a chair. She unpacked her 2 saddlebags and her trunk and put her books on the shelf above the stove. She had 4 of them, which she had hauled every mile since Abilene because there were certain things she refused to surrender, and she hung her father's old range knife on the wall, and she looked at the room and thought, "This will do." She started in the ledgers the next morning before Clem Dyer had even finished his breakfast. The records were not as bad as she had feared, but they were not good either. 3 years of inconsistent bookkeeping had left gaps and errors that were going to take a week to sort through properly, and she could see the shape of a man who was excellent at ranching and indifferent to paperwork. She did not judge him for it. She had seen it before. Some people thought in numbers, and some people thought in land and cattle and seasons, and there was no shame in knowing which one you were. She worked through the morning and had a preliminary picture of the accounts by afternoon, and she brought it to the main house at the end of the day as the sun was lowering over Red Bluff and turning the sandstone to fire. Aaron Graves was on his porch with a coffee cup when she came up the path, and he watched her approach with that same careful expression she was beginning to recognize as simply how his face worked. It was not unfriendly, it was just not easy. "Good news and middling news," she said, taking the chair he gestured toward without ceremony. "Give me the middling first," he said. The spring contract for the cattle drive to Amarillo was underpriced by approximately $8 a head. You lost something close to $300 on that arrangement. He closed his eyes briefly and opened them again. I suspected as much. The buyer was persuasive. He was predatory, she said flatly. I've seen the rate sheets from 2 other operations in the county. You were undercut deliberately. The good news is that your herd is in better condition than most of your neighbors, which means next season you have significant leverage if you negotiate properly. I can handle the negotiations if you want, or I can prepare you to handle them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You found all of that in one day." "I'm good with numbers," she said simply. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was different from the morning, less guarded, more genuinely present. "Yes," he said, "you are." That was all he said. But she rode back to her cabin that evening thinking that it was a good start, and she felt something she had not felt in 2 years, which was the sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that suited her. She was up before the sun, reviewing the day's plans over coffee at the small table by the east window, then out with Clem and Dutch to move the cattle to fresh pasture or check the fencing, or whatever the particular demands of the day required. She was not afraid of hard physical work, and both Clem and Dutch, who had each greeted her arrival with varying degrees of skepticism, came around fast. Clem came around first, because he was young and did not yet have the pride that sometimes made men slow to adjust. He was simply grateful to have someone who knew what they were doing. Dutch took longer, about 2 weeks, but the moment he saw her correctly diagnose a sick heifer that 2 other ranchers' hands had missed and saved the animal, he quietly moved over to her side and stayed there. Aaron Graves watched all of it. He was not a man who hovered. He had his own work and he did it, and she respected him for it, but she would sometimes look up from the pasture and see him watching from the ridge, or she would come back to find he had left fresh water at the workstation without saying anything about it. Small, thoughtful acts that she cataloged without reading too much into them. The trouble started at about the 6-week mark, and it came in the form of a man named Gerald Cass. Gerald Cass owned the ranch adjacent to Red Bluff, and he had apparently been negotiating to buy Aaron's grazing rights along the southern pasture for the better part of a year before Mary arrived. He was a wide-shouldered man in his mid-40s with a salesman's smile and eyes that did not match it, and when he rode onto Red Bluff land one Tuesday afternoon and found Mary reviewing the fence line records at the property corner, he did not bother to pretend he was pleased to see her. "You're the new foreman," he said, looking her over the way a man looks at a horse he is trying to find fault with. "I am," she said. "Where's Graves?" "In the north pasture. Can I help you?" He studied her for a moment. "You negotiating the grazing rights contract?" "If Mr. Graves asks me to, yes." He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Little lady, that's a complex business arrangement. Probably better handled by me," she said. "Since I am the foreman and that falls within my responsibilities. And Mr. Cass, I've seen your previous offer. It was not a serious one. If you'd like to make a serious one, I'm happy to take it to Mr. Graves." His smile dropped. He looked at her for a long moment in a way that was meant to be intimidating, and she held his gaze without moving a muscle because she had learned early that if you moved first you lost. Eventually, he wheeled his horse and rode back the way he had come without another word. She told Aaron about it that evening over the accounts. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Cass has a way of making things difficult, he said. He ran off the last two hands I had before Clem and Dutch. How? She asked. By making their lives unpleasant in the small, consistent ways that wear a person down, interfering with supply deliveries, spreading rumors in town, having his boys drive cattle across our fencing at night. She looked at him. And you've been dealing with this alone. Not alone, he said, but without a foreman. She thought about that. Do you want me to handle Cass, or do you want to handle him yourself? He looked at her steadily. What would handling him look like? Documentation, she said. Every incident written down and dated. And a counteroffer on the grazing rights that makes it economically clear to Cass that his best option is to deal fairly. Men like that respond to math better than to confrontation. The corner of his mouth moved. You think everything responds to math? Not everything, she said, but more things than people usually try it on. He looked at his coffee cup. All right, you handle it. She handled it. Over the next 3 weeks, she built a paper record of every interaction with Cass's operation, established a proper valuation of the grazing rights in question, and drafted a counteroffer that was so thoroughly documented and economically clear that when she presented it to Cass in Aaron's presence at a meeting in town, Cass accepted it with the disgruntled look of a man who knows he has been fairly beaten and does not like it. On the ride back to Red Bluff afterward, Aaron said, "That was remarkable. It was just paperwork," she said. Mary. It was the first time he had used her first name, and she noticed the slight adjustment in how he was sitting his horse, the minute self-consciousness of a man who had not intended to do a thing and then did it. That was not just paperwork. She smiled, and she did not try to argue with him because he was right. The days were getting shorter as September moved into October, and the Texas heat began to ease. And somewhere in that shortening of days, something else was changing too. Something she noticed but did not immediately name. Aaron Graves had started to sit on his porch longer in the evenings, and his porch faced her cabin, and more nights than not she would come out of her door after supper, and he would raise his coffee cup, and she would raise hers, and they would sit there each on their own bit of the evening and not quite be together, but not quite be separate either. It was Dutch Hooper who said something about it first, in his blunt, unsentimental way. He and Mary were mending the fence along the east pasture one morning when he said, without looking up from the wire, "Boss has been easier since you came." She kept working. "Easier how?" "Less like a man waiting for something bad to happen," Dutch said. "He gets like that, since the thing with Adelaide." She did not ask because it was not her place to ask, but Dutch continued anyway in the way that older working men sometimes do when they have carried a thing for a while. He was with a woman named Adelaide Cross for about 2 years, around 1879. She was the daughter of a merchant over in Clark's Mill. Fine-looking, charming, all of that. She strung him along while she was also letting another man court her, a banker from San Antonio, more money than Aaron. When the banker proposed, she left. Left Aaron with a letter he didn't even open for a week. That's how bad it got. He built that porch and sat on it for the better part of a winter. Mary was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard thing." "It is," Dutch said. "But the thing about Aaron is he's not a bitter man by nature. He just got careful." He looked at her then, direct and without apology. "You're different than the women he's known. I've watched him long enough to know when a thing is changing." "Dutch," she said. "I'm just telling you what I see," he said, and picked up the fence post and drove it home. She thought about it that evening, and she was honest with herself in the way she had always tried to be. There was something happening, something that had been building gradually in the quiet hours and the shared supper conversations and the evenings with the coffee cups, something that she had been calling professional respect and working ease because it was safer to call it that. But Dutch's words had named something she had been not naming, and once a thing is named, it is harder to put back in the box. She was not looking for love. She had come here for work. She had made that clear to Aaron and to herself. But she was 26 years old and she was not made of stone, and Aaron Graves was a decent, honest, careful man who had been hurt by the wrong kind of woman and who had quietly, steadily shown her more genuine respect in 2 months than most men showed in a lifetime. She did not do anything about it. She was not the sort of person who acted on feeling without thinking through the consequences. She went to work. She managed the accounts. She handled the cattle. She fixed what needed fixing, and she was good at all of it, and she let whatever was building between them build at whatever pace it needed to. October brought the first cold nights and the golden andrust color that settled over the Texas scrub, and with it came the county fair at Sallow Creek, which was an annual event significant enough that even Aaron Graves, who did not particularly enjoy large gatherings, attended. He came to her cabin door on the morning of the fair with his hat in his hand and asked if she would like to ride in together, since they were both going, and she said yes, and they rode the 6 miles into town side by side with the cold morning air between them and the low sun on the red bluffs. The fair was noise and color, and the smell of smoked meat and horse and hay, and it was clear immediately that Aaron Graves was well known here. People called to him, stopped to shake his hand, the ranchers and the merchants and the families who made up the sinew of this county. He introduced her easily, without any awkwardness, and she noticed that he did not introduce her as the hired help or as the foreman or as anything that reduced her. He just said her name and let her stand on her own, which she thought was exactly right. Hattie Bloom found her at the dry goods table and pulled her aside with the energy of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. "You're still there," Hattie said, meaning at Red Bluff. 3 months now, Mary said. "And how is he?" Hattie asked in a tone that suggested she was not asking about the cattle. Mary smiled. "He's a good employer." Hattie looked at her steadily. "Mary Kendrick, I have known Aaron Graves since he was 17 years old, and I know what that man looks like when he is just being a boss, and I know what he looks like when he is something more than that." Mary opened her mouth and Hattie held up one hand. "I am not warning you away from him," Hattie said. "I want to be clear about that. I was warning you away from what I thought he'd become after Adelaide. But I have been watching the two of you this morning, and what I see is a man who has come back to himself." She paused. "You have been good for him." Mary did not say anything for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I think he might have been good for me too." Hattie smiled, and it was the kind of smile that only women who have loved and lost and loved again can give, deep and knowing and without any jealousy. "Well then," she said, "there you are." The afternoon of the fair had a roping competition, and Clem Dyer entered it with the enthusiasm of a young man who wanted very badly to impress someone, and happened to be actually skilled enough to do it. And he won, which made him so pleased with himself that he bought 2 rounds of cider at the refreshment table. Dutch Hooper watched from under the brim of his hat with the expression of a man who found the young deeply exhausting and also faintly endearing. Mary watched the competition from the fence rail, and after a few minutes Aaron came and leaned against the rail beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm near hers in the October air. They watched Clem's final run and cheered with the crowd, and the noise and the press of people made the closeness feel natural and unremarkable, and when the noise settled Aaron stayed where he was and she stayed where she was, and they were standing quite close together now. "He's good," Aaron said, meaning Clem. "He is," Mary agreed. "Better than he knows yet." "I've noticed that about him," Aaron said. "He needs someone to tell him." "You could tell him." He was quiet a moment. "I'm not always the best at saying things directly." She glanced at him sidelong, and he was looking at the ring where the next contestant was preparing, his profile clean against the October sky. "You've been fairly direct with me," she said. He paused. "You make it easy." She looked at the ring. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. You don't require performance," he said. "You just require honesty, which is a rare thing." She did not answer right away because she was trying to be careful, and she said, finally, "You know what Hattie Bloom told me when I first arrived?" "I know what Hattie tells everyone," he said without heat. "She told me you were done with women." "I was done with a certain kind of woman," he said, and his voice had dropped a register, quieter, more careful. "A kind that wants the version of things more than the things themselves. I was done with beauty that's a strategy, warmth that's a calculation. I was done with feeling like a means to an end." He paused. "I was not done with," he stopped. She waited. "With the real thing," he said, "if it existed." She turned to look at him then, and he turned to look at her at the same moment, and they were very close, and the fair was loud and busy around them, and none of it felt like it was happening in the same world as this particular 6 inches of October air between two people who had been circling something honest for 3 months. "It exists," she said. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before on his face, something open and almost startled, as if he had not expected her to say that, as if he had not expected himself to want her to. "Mary," he said. "Aaron," she said. And then Clem appeared between them, holding his prize ribbon and grinning at the entirety of creation, and the moment broke and they both turned toward him, and Mary was grateful for the interruption and also deeply, helplessly not grateful for it at all. That evening, riding home in the long blue dusk of October with the red bluffs ahead and the stars just beginning to come out, they rode more closely than they usually did, their horses shoulder to shoulder, and they talked, really talked, in a way they had not quite managed before. He told her about his parents, who had come from Virginia after the war and built the first version of Red Bluff with their bare hands. He told her about learning to run cattle from a man named Price, who had been his father's oldest friend, and who had died of pneumonia when Aaron was 22, and left a hole that took years to stop feeling like a wound. She told him about her father and about Abilene and about the flood that took everything, and she was able to tell it without the grief swallowing her, for the first time, because there was something about talking to a person who understood what land meant, what the loss of it felt like, that made it speakable. They reached the gate of Red Bluff and he got down to open it, which he always did, and she rode through, which she always did. But tonight, when he remounted and caught up to her on the path to the house, he said, "I don't want this evening to end." She looked straight ahead. "It doesn't have to," she said. "We could sit on your porch for a while." "Yes," he said, "we could." They sat on his porch for 2 hours, with coffee that got cold and a sky full of stars, and the sounds of the ranch settling into the night around them. They did not say anything that could be called a declaration, but by the time she walked back to her cabin, she knew something had changed permanently, and she thought he knew it too. The next 2 weeks were a lesson in the particular tenderness of two careful people moving toward each other. There was nothing rushed about it. There were evenings on the porch, and conversations over the accounts that went longer than the accounts required, and a morning when she arrived at the barn to find he had saddled her horse before she got there because he knew she had a long ride ahead, and she stood there looking at that saddled horse for a long moment before she said, very quietly, "Thank you," and he said, "Of course," and they were both talking about considerably more than the horse. There was the afternoon. It rained hard out of a gray sky, and they were both in the barn waiting it out, and he read from one of her books while she worked on the accounts, and it was so comfortable, so entirely like two people who had been doing this for years, that she suddenly found she could not quite breathe right. She put down her pen. He looked up. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And then, because she had never been a woman for strategically deployed honesty, she said, "I am trying not to fall in love with you." He put the book down. He was very still. "Is it working?" he asked. She looked at him. "Not particularly." He stood up from his seat and came toward her slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been burned before and was choosing to walk toward the fire anyway, and he stopped in front of her, and he reached out and took her face between his hands, and he looked at her as though she were something he had not expected and was still trying to fully understand. "I was told a long time ago," he said, "that I was too serious, too plain speaking, that I didn't know how to court a woman the right way. His thumb traced along her cheekbone. Adelaide said it once near the end. Adelaide was wrong, Mary said, and she meant it with every piece of her. He kissed her, and it was not the hurried, performed thing that first kisses sometimes are when two people have been anticipating them too long. It was slow and real, and it tasted like coffee and the October air. And when they separated, the rain was still going outside and neither of them moved for a long time. "I should have said something weeks ago," he said quietly. "You said it when you were ready," she said. "That's the right way." He rested his forehead against hers. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I didn't expect anything," he said. "That was the problem. I had stopped expecting anything good." A pause. "And then you rode into my yard at first light with your ledger and your opinions, and your complete indifference to what anyone told you about me." She laughed, and it felt like something she had not felt in a long time, the kind of laugh that comes from a full chest. "My indifference did serve me well," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It did." The weeks that followed were the particular joy of two people who have been careful for a long time discovering that there is someone worth being less careful for. He was not demonstrably different in his public manner. Aaron Graves was a private man, and he would always be a private man, but in the small, constant ways that people who know someone well can read, everything had shifted. He laughed more. He sat easier. He talked about the future, which she came to realize he had stopped doing for a while, the future of the ranch, the future of the herd, plans for the spring that assumed continuity and growth. She was happy. She had not said that word to herself in 2 years, but she tested it, and it was true. There were practical complications, of course, because there always were. There was the question of her role. She was technically his employee, and they were both careful and honest people who were aware that the arrangement needed to be addressed properly. He raised it one evening with characteristic directness. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the irregularity of the current situation." "Which irregularity specifically?" she said, because she wanted to make him say it. The corners of his mouth moved. "The irregularity in which I am personally involved with my foreman." "I've been thinking about it too," she said, and he asked, "And I think," she said, "that the solution probably involves changing one of those roles." He was quiet. Then he said, "I would very much like to change the role, if it is something you want." She looked at him and he looked at her, and it was the most quietly momentous conversation she could remember having. "I want the work to stay mine," she said. "Whatever title we put on my role here, I want to keep doing the work." "You will always keep doing the work," he said with complete conviction. "I wouldn't have it any other way." "Then yes," she said simply. "It's something I want." He took her hand across the table where the ledgers still lay open, and he held it, and he said, "Good." It was November when Gerald Cass made his final attempt to cause trouble, and it came not in the form of business, but in the form of a rumor, a particularly ugly one that began making its rounds in Sallow Creek in the way that the worst rumors do, through the mechanisms of half-said things and pointed looks. The substance of it was that Mary Kendrick had not been hired for her qualifications, but for another purpose entirely, which was the kind of thing men said when a woman was doing work they had decided women could not do. Mary heard it from Clem, who heard it at the feed store and who came to her red-faced and furious, and she sat with him in the barn and let him run through his anger and then said, "Thank you for telling me. I mean, Cass's boys who are spreading it, I could go and you will do nothing," she said firmly, "because responding with force would make it a story, and right now it's just a rumor and rumors die when they run out of fuel." "How do you take that so calmly?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "Because I know what's true," she said, "and so does everyone who matters. And Cass is doing this because I beat him on the grazing rights contract, which means I'm doing my job correctly." She did tell Aaron that same evening, because she was not going to keep something like that from him, and because she wanted to see how he handled it. He sat very still for a moment when she told him, and then he stood up with the controlled, deliberate movement of a man managing a great deal of anger very carefully. "He will hear from me," Aaron said. "He will hear from us," she said, Together, tomorrow morning, in town where there are witnesses." He looked at her. "Why witnesses?" "Because a private meeting settles a private grievance, but what Cass is doing is public. It requires a public response. We go to town together, we are seen together, we conduct ourselves with complete dignity, and we let the people of this county draw their own conclusions from what they actually see with their own eyes." He thought about that. "You're right," he said. "I am usually right," she said, and he almost smiled. They rode to town the next morning, and they were seen together, greeting the people they knew, Mary discussing the upcoming cattle numbers with the men who handled the regional contracts, Aaron talking to the county land office about the spring survey he needed. They were competent, professional, and entirely themselves, and by noon the story had shifted from Cass's version to the one that was simply visible: two people running a good ranch. Hattie Bloom stopped them outside the general store and looked at the two of them together and said, with enormous satisfaction, "Well, it's about time." Aaron looked at Mary. Mary looked at Aaron. "Mrs. Bloom," Aaron said with some dignity, "you have an extraordinary talent for saying out loud what everyone else is thinking." "Someone has too," Hattie said. "Are you going to ask her properly, or am I going to have to arrange something?" "Hattie," Mary said, between mortification and laughter. "I'm just asking," Hattie said, and walked into the store with the composure of a woman who has accomplished exactly what she came to accomplish. He asked her properly as it happened, a week later. He did not make a production of it. He was not a man for productions. He came to her cabin on a Sunday evening when the first real cold of winter was in the air and the stars were brilliant and hard overhead, and he knocked on her door even though he could have called from the porch, and when she opened it, he had his hat in his hands again, which was the thing he did when he was working himself up to something. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what Mrs. Bloom said." "He says a great many things," Mary said. "She asked if I was going to ask you properly," he said, "and I realized I hadn't and I should, and I have been—" He stopped, took a breath. "I have been afraid of this, not of you, of wanting something this much and having it disappear. I made a rule after Adelaide that I was finished with this kind of wanting because I was not going to be a fool twice." She was very still. "And then you came," he said, "and you were not what I thought women were. You were not what I had categorized and set aside. You were something I did not have a category for. You were honest and capable and funny in that quiet way you have, and you looked at my ledgers like they personally offended you, and you took Gerald Cass apart with nothing but a pencil and a piece of paper, and every single evening I have thought about how I do not want to go back to the way things were before you." He paused. "I know we have not known each other very long by the standards some people use." "4 months," she said. "4 months," he agreed. "But I have spent 4 months watching you every day, and I know—" He stopped again, and she could see it cost him, this amount of open speaking, this much door thrown wide. "I know who you are," he said. "I know what kind of person you are, and I would like very much to spend the rest of my life knowing it." She stepped forward and took the hat from his hands because his hands were gripping it too tightly, and she held his hands instead. They were rough and warm, and she knew those hands. "I would like that too," she said. "Mary Kendrick," he said with a solemnity that was entirely real, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "Aaron Graves, I will." He kissed her, and the winter air was cold around them, and the cabin was warm behind her, and somewhere out in the dark pasture, one of the cattle called and was answered, and none of it could have been more perfect. They were married in December, in the little white church in Sallow Creek, in a ceremony that was short and practical because neither of them wanted ceremony for its own sake, but which was attended by most of the county because Hattie Bloom had organized the reception, and Hattie's organizing was not a thing anyone declined. Clem Dyer cried a little and was deeply embarrassed about it. Dutch Hooper shook Aaron's hand and then shook Mary's hand with equal gravity and said, "Good," which from Dutch was approximately equivalent to a sonnet. Hattie Bloom wore her best dress and spent the reception with an expression of complete satisfaction. They rode home to Red Bluff as husband and wife with the December stars overhead and the whole of the winter ahead of them, and the ranch was lit by the lanterns they had left burning, warm against the dark scrub country, and Mary looked at it and felt the word home settle in her chest like something that had finally found its right place. The winter was a good one. Mary kept the accounts and managed the contracts, and Aaron ran the cattle and the land, and Clem grew into a confident young man under the dual influence of two people who were genuinely good at what they did, and Dutch continued to be Dutch, which was reliable and dry and excellent. The evenings were long and the fire was good, and they read together and talked together and sat together in the comfortable, specific silence of two people who knew each other and did not need to fill all the space with noise. She learned things about him that she had not known, which was the pleasure of the early months of marriage, not revelations, because he was not a man with secrets, but details. He could not carry a tune, but he sang along with everything anyway, very quietly, under his breath, when he did not know she was listening. He had an old dog, a red and white cattle dog named Pip, who was 11 years old and moved slowly but followed Aaron everywhere. He had a small collection of stones that he kept on the windowsill, interesting rocks from different parts of the land. Nothing valuable, just shapes and colors that had caught his eye over the years. She found them deeply moving in a way she could not fully articulate, that private, unperformed collecting of beautiful small things. He learned things about her too, that she could not sleep if she had not read for at least 30 minutes first, no matter how tired she was. That she argued with the cattle under her breath when they were being stubborn, a steady, low, remarkably specific monologue that she was not entirely aware she was doing. That she had learned to cook under considerable duress from a woman in Abilene who had no patience for incompetence in the kitchen, and that she was an excellent cook who found cooking less interesting than most other things she did, but who fed people well anyway, because she had decided that feeding people was a form of care and care was something she believed in. Spring came to the Texas Hill Country the way it always does, suddenly and decisively, and the work expanded again with the season. They had a strong calf crop that year, healthy and numerous, which meant the spring drive numbers looked good, and Mary negotiated the contract with a buyer in Amarillo that more than made up for the shortfall of the previous year. She did it by letter, meticulous and detailed, and when the agreement came back signed, she showed it to Aaron, and he looked at the numbers and then looked at her with an expression that was everything. "You know," he said, "that Cass is going to find out about this figure and it is going to ruin his entire spring." "Yes," she said serenely. "I know." He laughed, a full, genuine laugh, and she thought it was possibly the best sound she had ever heard. There was a particular afternoon in April when she went looking for Aaron, and found him at the place on the southern ridge where the bluffs met the long grass, a place she had come to know as his thinking place. He was sitting on the ground with his back against the sandstone, and his hat over his eyes and Pip curled at his side, and she sat down next to him without saying anything, and he pushed his hat back and looked at her with the easy openness that had replaced the old carefulness, the expression that she thought was the real Aaron Graves, the one that had always been there under the protective layer. "I was thinking about the east pasture fence," he said. "I was thinking about the ledgers," she said. "We are very romantic people," he said. She leaned into him, and his arm went around her, and they sat there on the ridge with the afternoon sun warm on their faces and red bluff spread out below them, the cattle moving in the near pasture, the house with the thin thread of smoke rising from the kitchen chimney. She thought about where she had been a year ago, in that hotel in Sallow Creek with the dust on her coat and Hattie Bloom pressing flour into her hands, and a warning about a man she had not met yet. She thought about her father, about Abilene, about the flood. "I'm glad I answered the advertisement," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I placed that advertisement and I took it back 3 times before I finally sent it." She sat up to look at him. "You did?" "I kept thinking, what is the point?" he said. "The ranch can run as it is. Why complicate things?" He met her eyes. "And then I thought, because it needs someone who is actually good at the parts I'm bad at, and I sent it. And 3 weeks later, I got a letter from a woman named Mary Kendrick who listed her qualifications with a specificity that was almost aggressive. It was entirely aggressive, she said. It was, he agreed. And I thought, here is someone who is not interested in anything except whether she is right for the job. So I wrote back. He paused. I was not prepared for you. No one is ever prepared, she said gently. No, he agreed. I suppose not. He pulled her close again. I'm glad I sent it too. The following months brought their first major challenge, a drought that moved through the county in the late summer and tested every rancher in the region. Water sources dried up earlier than usual, and the cattle needed to be moved frequently to find adequate grazing. It was hard work, longer days, genuine strain, and Mary watched Aaron move through it with a steadiness that she had come to recognize as his truest quality, not optimism, which was too easy and too fragile, but endurance. The capacity to look at a hard thing and stay. She matched him in it. They worked side by side those months in a way that was different from the orderly division of duties they usually maintained. There was no time for that, and working that closely under that kind of pressure taught her the last thing she needed to know about him. He did not panic. He did not blame. When one of the water sources they had been relying on dried up entirely, he looked at the dry creek bed for a long moment and then said, "All right. We dig," and they dug, and found water at depth, and it cost 3 weeks of hard labor, but the cattle made it through. By September, the drought broke and the land recovered, and the herd numbers were not as bad as they might have been. They had lost some animals, but fewer than their neighbors, and the ones they had were in reasonable condition. Mary revised the autumn accounts and found that they were bruised but not broken, and she brought the numbers to Aaron the evening after the rain finally came and set them on the table and said, "We're going to be fine." He looked at the numbers. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "we are." She became pregnant that autumn, and she knew it a full month before she said anything to Aaron, not because she was keeping it from him, but because she needed to sit with it herself first to understand what she felt. What she felt, when she finally understood it clearly, was a joy so large it was almost frightening, the kind of joy that comes with stakes, the kind that means you have something enormous to lose and are choosing to love it anyway. She told him on a Sunday morning, simply over coffee, the way she told him most things. He sat very still for a moment after she said it, and she watched his face carefully, because with Aaron the important things happened in the small shifts rather than the large gestures. He set down his cup. He stood up. He came around the table and he held her face in his hands the way he had in the barn the first time, and his eyes were bright, and he said, "Mary." "I know," she said. "A baby," he said, as if testing the word. "A baby," she confirmed. He held her for a long time, right there in the kitchen with the morning light coming in and the coffee going cold, and she felt his arms around her and his face pressed into her hair, and she thought about the man Dutch had described, the man who had sat on his porch through a whole winter after Adelaide and who had stopped expecting anything good. She held him back and she thought, not anymore. The winter of 1883 came with less severity than the winter before, and the ranch moved through it well. She managed her work through the pregnancy with the same unsentimental competence she brought to everything, adjusting what needed adjusting and refusing to adjust what did not need adjusting. Aaron worried more than she did, which was endearing and occasionally maddening in the specific way that a good man's excessive care can be maddening. "I am perfectly capable of reviewing the ledgers," she told him one morning when he tried to suggest she rest. "No one said you weren't capable," he said. "Your expression said it." "My expression was asking if you had eaten breakfast." She looked at him. "Have I eaten breakfast?" "I don't know," he said. "Have you?" "No," she admitted. He went and made her breakfast, and she reviewed the ledgers, and they were both right, and it was exactly the kind of small marital standoff that resolves itself happily. She found a great deal to think about that winter in the long evenings by the fire. She thought about what they were building here, the two of them together, and she found it remarkable, not in the dramatic sense, because there was nothing dramatic about it in the way the word is sometimes meant. It was remarkable in the quieter sense, the way a good piece of work is remarkable, something built to last, built right, built from the right materials by people who knew what they were doing. She had grown up in a world that had a particular set of ideas about what women were for, and she had spent most of her adult life working against those ideas not out of bitterness, but out of simple practicality. Those ideas were wrong about her, and wrong things needed to be corrected. She had met men who resented her for it, and men who tolerated her for it, and men who pretended not to see it. She had not, until Aaron, met a man who simply met her as she was and found that to be entirely fine. He was not a revolutionary. He was not working through any particular framework of thought about women and their place in the world. He was just a man who saw Mary Kendrick clearly and valued what he saw, which perhaps was the most revolutionary thing of all. She told him this one evening, trying to articulate it, and he listened as he always did, fully and without preparing his response while she was still speaking, and when she finished he said, "You make it sound complicated." "It is complicated," she said. "You are a person," he said. "You are a capable, honest, intelligent person. Why would I treat you as anything less than that?" "Because most men do," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then most men are fools," he said. "And I have been told before that I am too plain-speaking and too serious and not enough of things that would make me charming." He met her eyes. "I think, all things considered, that plain-speaking serves a man better in the end." "I think so too," she said. Their son was born in the spring of 1884, on an April morning when the bluffs were glowing amber and the grass had come back thick and green from the drought. He came into the world with a considerable amount of energy and opinion, and Mary, who had not imagined herself to be a woman who would cry at that moment, found herself weeping with a completeness that was nothing like grief. The midwife, a capable woman from Sallow Creek named Mrs. Farrow, handed the baby to Aaron first, because Mary needed a moment, and because Mrs. Farrow had good instincts, and Mary watched Aaron Graves hold his son for the first time with the expression of a man from whom every wall, every carefully built protection, every layer of defense against good things had fallen entirely away. He looked at the baby and then he looked at her, and there were no words for what was in his face, but she understood it completely. "Hello," Aaron said to the baby, in the voice she would come to associate with those moments, quiet and direct and entirely real. "I've been waiting for you." They named him James for Aaron's father, and he was from the first moment a decided, energetic person who had strong opinions about sleeping and feeding and the red-and-white dog Pip, whom he regarded with an absolute and devoted fascination. The months after James's birth were full in every sense, full of work and full of noise and full of the specific exhaustion that comes with a new person in the house, and full too of a happiness that Mary thought she was still learning to hold properly, like a vessel she was still figuring out how to carry. Clem Dyer, who was now 21 and had grown into a genuinely skilled young rancher, was so charmed by James that he became the baby's unofficial guard dog, and could often be found sitting on the porch with the baby in his arms, recounting the day's events in a patient, detailed monologue. Dutch Hooper held the baby once, very briefly, with the expression of a man diffusing an explosive, and handed him back to Mary with a relief that made her laugh for a full minute. Hattie Bloom came to see them when James was 3 weeks old and held him with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised several of her own, and she looked at Aaron and she looked at Mary, and she had the expression she had been wearing since the county fair, the expression of thoroughgoing satisfaction, and she said, "I knew it from the first morning." "You warned me away from him," Mary reminded her. "I warned you that he was guarded," Hattie said, "which he was. I did not say he was not worth the trying." She looked at Aaron. "I always knew Aaron Graves was a good man who had been managed by the wrong woman. I just had to wait for the right one." Aaron gave her the look he reserved for people who were being irrefutably right about him. "Thank you, Hattie," he said, which was the nearest he would get to acknowledging it. Hattie smiled and handed the baby back and accepted the coffee Mary poured and sat down at the kitchen table as if she had been sitting there her whole life. The years that followed at Red Bluff were, Mary would say later, the years when the ranch became what it had always had the potential to be. The accounts stabilized and grew. The herd expanded smartly, not recklessly. Clem stayed on as senior hand, and eventually took on a younger man of his own, a boy from across the county named Silas, who reminded Mary uncomfortably of what Clem had been at 19, capable, eager, and entirely uncertain of his own worth. She ran him through the same quiet process she had run Clem through, and he improved. Gerald Cass, having failed to run either of them off, and having signed a fair contract under duress, eventually sold his ranch to a family from Houston and moved on, which improved the climate of the county considerably. The new neighbors, a couple named Ruiz with 3 children and a serious dedication to their cattle, became genuine friends. Mary in particular found in Alina Ruiz someone who understood the specific experience of being a woman who worked and was not ashamed of it, and they had a friendship that was the comfortable, practical kind, built on mutual respect and occasional rescue. James grew. He was dark-haired like his father and plain-speaking like his mother, and entirely himself from the first moment of consciousness. A child who watched everything carefully and made his judgments and acted on them. He took to horses early, which Aaron considered inevitable, and to numbers, which Mary considered her victory. In the spring of 1887, when James was 3 years old and beginning to have full, complex, exhausting conversations about everything, Mary sat across from Aaron at the kitchen table after the ledgers were put away and said, "I have been thinking." He looked at her with the expression that meant he was giving her his full attention. "Yes, I think Red Bluff is ready to expand. Not the herd, the operation. I think we should be handling our own contracts rather than going through the regional broker. We have the size and the reputation now. We could save a significant amount over 3 years." He considered it with the seriousness he gave everything she said. "That would require someone making the trips to Amarillo. It would require you or me making 2 trips a year," she said, "which we could manage with Clem here to hold things." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been running the numbers." "I've been running the numbers for about a month," she admitted. He stood up and came around the table and kissed her on the top of her head with the deep, unceremonious affection that was his particular expression of love. "You never stop," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't." "That is not a complaint," he said. "I know," she said. She handled the first direct contract trip herself to Amarillo in October of 1887, and she came back with a contract so favorable that Aaron read it twice before he said anything. Then he said, "How?" "I was prepared," she said. "I knew their position going in. I had documentation of our herd quality, and I was patient." She paused. "And I may have let them think they were getting the better end of it until they had already signed." He looked at her across the table with the expression that she had come to understand was the fullest version of Aaron Graves's love, the expression of a man who saw someone completely and found the complete version wonderful. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I am thorough," she said. "Both," he said. James, who was sitting on the floor with Pip the elderly dog making the most of his final slow year, looked up at this exchange with the interest of a child who understood more than people thought and said, "Papa, are you sweet-talking Mama again?" He had heard Clem use the phrase and had stored it away for deployment. Aaron and Mary both looked at their son, and then at each other, and the laughter that came was the kind that fills a room and spills out of it, the kind that means everyone in the space is entirely, completely, unreservedly happy. Pip passed away that winter, at the age of 14, which was a grief that ran deep and quiet through the house. Aaron buried him at the base of the bluff in the old dog's favorite patch of sun, and James, who was too young to fully understand but old enough to feel the weight of it, sat next to his father and was very solemn and held Aaron's hand the way small children sometimes hold a grown person's hand when they sense the grown person needs it. Mary watched them from a small distance and felt a love so large it had no edge she could find. Pip's absence left a particular quiet in the house for a few weeks, and then Clem, in a gesture of such clumsy generosity that it was impossible not to love him for it, appeared one morning with a puppy, a red cattle dog, 2 months old, with enormous paws and more confidence than was warranted. James named her Clara, and she promptly made her opinions about everyone and everything known, and the quiet was gone. In the summer of 1888, Mary discovered she was pregnant again, and this time there was no months-long private processing. She told Aaron the same day she knew, because she had learned in 4 years of marriage that there was nothing she needed to sit with alone that was not better shared. He took her hands across the table, same kitchen, same man, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "James is going to be insufferable about this." "He's going to be the best older brother in Texas," she said. "He's going to be the most opinionated older brother in Texas," Aaron said. "Same thing in this family," she said. He smiled and she smiled, and outside the window the summer was bright, and everything was ordinary, and everything was exactly as it should be. She thought, sometimes, about the woman who had ridden into Sallow Creek that morning in 1882 with dust on her coat and a letter in her pocket. That woman had been strong, but she had been stripped of almost everything: the land, the father, the particular identity that comes with having a place. She had been holding herself together by the certainty of her own competence, which was not nothing, but which was also not the whole of what a person needed. She had been told the rancher was done with women. She had heard it twice before she ever met him. She had filed it under other people's business and ridden on. He had been done with the wrong kind, with the performed warmth and the strategic beauty and the love that was a calculation. He had shut down that part of himself and rebuilt around the loss, built the fence tighter, the walls higher, and called it sensible. But some things find the gaps, and Mary Kendrick had not been looking for a gap to find. She had simply been herself, fully and without apology, and herself turned out to be exactly and specifically the thing that the walls of Aaron Graves had no defense against. Because the walls had been built against performance, and she had never performed. The walls had been built against dishonesty, and she had never been anything but direct. The walls had been built against someone who wanted the version of things rather than the things themselves, and she had only ever wanted the real. She was something else. She had known it about herself for a long time. She was just glad he had known it too. In the autumn of 1888, their second child was born. A boy again, dark-haired, serious-faced, studying the world with an expression of careful evaluation that made Mary laugh because she had seen that exact expression on his father every day of her life. They named him William, for no one in particular, just because it was a name that suited him. James, who had been prepared for this moment by his mother's careful explanation and his own considerable readiness to have something to be in charge of, announced to Clara the dog that his brother had arrived and that the arrangements were now finalized. "He's very small," James reported to Aaron with some concern. "You were that small once," Aaron told him. James considered this. "I grew out of it," he said with satisfaction. "He will too," Aaron assured him. James accepted this and went to sit next to his mother and held the baby with the focused, responsible gravity of a 4-year-old who has taken on a serious obligation. Mary watched him, and she felt the familiar enormity, the joy with the stakes, the love you choose because you know it can cost you and you choose it anyway. Aaron sat on the edge of the bed, and he was looking at all of them, James holding William, Mary watching James with the expression that had replaced, entirely and permanently, the careful closed expression of the man she had met on that first morning. The open expression. The one that meant he was not protecting himself from good things anymore. She reached out and took his hand. He held it. The winter came in over the red bluffs, and the cattle stood in the pasture, and Clem Dyer managed the morning check with Silas at his side, and Dutch Hooper walked the fence line as he had walked it every morning for years. James kept his serious older brother's watch over William, who was growing faster than anyone could quite account for. Clara the dog herded everything that moved, including, on several memorable occasions, James himself. Mary sat at the kitchen table in the evenings with the ledgers and the contracts, and the accounts that told the story of a ranch that was living well. And Aaron sat across from her with the accounts he was reviewing or the book he was reading, or, sometimes, with nothing at all, just sitting across from her in the particular comfort of a man who has found his right place and knows it. Some nights she would look up and catch him looking at her, and she would raise an eyebrow, and he would say something like, "The east fence needs checking." And she would say, "You are not thinking about the east fence." And he would almost smile and say, "No, I suppose not." And she would go back to the ledgers and he would go back to whatever he was doing, and the fire would burn low, and the children would sleep, and the Texas night would be enormous and quiet outside the windows. There was nothing they needed that they did not have. There was nothing they had that they had not worked for together in the plain and honest way of two people who believed that the work was worth doing, and that the right person beside you made all the difference between endurance and joy. She was the foreman's wife, and the foreman, and the mother, and the woman who had refused to let a town's worth of warnings send her back down the road she'd come from. He was the rancher who had built his walls carefully and loved poorly once and learned from it and waited, without knowing he was waiting, for someone who would not require him to be anything other than what he was. On a spring morning in 1889, when James was 5 and William was 6 months old, and Clara had knocked over the water bucket for the third time that week and the bluffs were turning amber in the early light, Mary Kendrick stood on the porch of the Red Bluff Ranch house and looked at everything she could see. The grass was green and long in the near pasture. The cattle were moving slowly in the morning way they had, calm and content. Clem was saddling up near the barn, whistling something that wasn't quite a tune. The new season's accounts were tidy in the ledger on the kitchen table, and the spring contract was signed and good, and the children were inside with Aaron, and she could hear through the window the sound of James telling his father something of great importance and Aaron responding in the steady, patient way he had, giving every word his full attention. She had a cup of coffee in her hands and the morning air was clean and cold, and the sky was enormous, the way the Texas sky always was, uncaged and brilliant, and she was 33 years old and she had her hands in everything she had ever wanted and she was, without question or equivocation, entirely happy. The door opened behind her and Aaron came out, William on his hip, James at his heel, and he stood beside her and looked out over the ranch the way they had both looked out from the ridge that April afternoon, and he handed her the baby without ceremony and she took him and settled him against her hip and they stood there, the four of them in the morning light. "Ready?" he said, meaning the day. "Always," she said, meaning everything. He put his arm around her, warm and certain, and James grabbed the porch rail and looked out at the ranch with the proprietary satisfaction of a 5-year-old who considers himself its rightful heir. And Clara appeared from around the corner of the house and sat down with the dignity of a dog who has decided to pretend the water bucket incident did not occur. The light came fully over the bluffs and turned the red stone to gold, and the day began.